welcome to our discussion about issues of importance to the Caucasus. 3 weeks into the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we are learning that this is more than a conflict over who has rights to the territory of Nagorno Karabakh. It is a war highly affected by internal and external influences, many of which are economic. We are lucky to have Professor Rob Sobhani today, Chairman and CEO of the Caspian Group and an expert on Russia, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Dr. Sobhani, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Joanna.
Let's begin by what the Russians, who brokered this first ceasefire that was broken, what did they want and why?
I think the motivations of Russia are twofold. Number one, it's strategic geopolitical, which is to keep the Caucasus within the orbit of Russia. It is the periphery of the former Soviet Union, after all. And so for Mr. Putin to keep Armenia-Azerbaijan within the orbit of Russia is a key strategic objective. Equally important is Russia's economic motivation. Keep in mind that Russia sells gas to Europe to the tune of around $111 billion each year. Any extra gas coming from Azerbaijan or the Caspian that displaces Russian gas is obviously not in the interest of Mr. Putin. So I think it's important to note that Russian motivation, as it concerns the Caucasus, is also driven by Russia's economic interests.
I think the oil and gas issue, which you're an expert on, has a lot to do with how this conflict touches a lot of other countries as well. And Azerbaijan's economy is built on oil and gas, and it has a very close relationship with British petroleum. And so what would happen? How many other countries would be involved if one of the Armenian bombs actually hit an oil pipeline that belonged to British petroleum? What other countries would become involved?
So that's a very good question. In fact, in July, the first attack on Azerbaijan happened in the corridor through which the pipeline carrying Azerbaijan oil and gas traverses into Georgia and then on into Turkey to Europe. And so that was an indication for me that there certainly is an economic element to Russian motivation. Now, as far as a disruption, there are at least 3 non-Russian players who would have immediate interest in a stable transportation of oil and gas out of the Caspian into the European markets. Number one is Europe itself, obviously, led by its private sector. But let's not forget also what follows British Petroleum is also followed by the British flag. And so certainly the British would have an interest in a stable transportation corridor, number one. Number two, I would say it's the broader European Union. The French have signed offtake agreements for Azerbaijan gas. So the French would have a strong interest in making sure that there's stability of transportation. And then, of course, there's Turkey. Turkey gets a lot of its oil and gas from Azerbaijan. And in fact, Turkey has also signed agreements with Azerbaijan. So to the extent that the corridor is stable, it's to the interest of the British, the French, Turkey. And let me just add that since President Clinton's first visit with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, the late President Aliyev, one of the fundamental shared goals that President Clinton discussed with President Aliyev was the stable transportation of oil and gas from the Caspian to world markets. In fact, it might be interesting for your viewers to know there are cargoes that land from Azerbaijan into the Philadelphia refinery. Yes, from Azerbaijan into the Philadelphia refinery.
Directly through, obviously, transport from Baku to Tbilisi, Georgia, to Ceyhan, the port in Turkey, and then by cargo ships all the way to the east coast of the United States. Now, why is that? Because the oil quality of Azerbaijan is one of the highest in the world, which is why Hitler's first goal was to capture the Baku oil fields. So for the European consumers and for the United States, Azerbaijan has a very important geopolitical significance. And it has been a significant effect on the Azerbaijan's ability to grow its economy, to expand its possible influence around the world, is because of that rich oil that is right there in the Caspian Sea.
Absolutely. It's very important to note that in the early days when I visited Azerbaijan, this was in the 1990s, there was disruption. With disruption comes unemployment. With unemployment comes poverty. But Azerbaijan has been able to leverage its oil and gas. And today, according to the World Bank, poverty rates in Azerbaijan have fallen to below 5%. That is a historic achievement. And it also means, importantly, that the middle class of Azerbaijan now has broadened. And to the extent that you have a broader middle class, that is a stable economic growth formula. So you're absolutely right, Joanna. Oil is important for the consumers in Europe, to the extent possible the US, but also it's been a blessing for the people of Azerbaijan because, as I said, poverty rates are now down below 5%.
I want to ask you, thank you, Professor. I want to also ask you a little bit about a country that you have some close relationship with. You spent some of your younger years in Iran. And what part does Iran play? Is that an economic part? Is that a political part? Is that a religious part? What part does Iran play in this conflict?
Well, your viewers might be interested to know that the Iranian regime views Azerbaijan through a very skeptical and, to a certain extent, negative lens. And there are maybe three fundamental reasons for that. A, Azerbaijan has relations with Israel. Iran is an enemy of Israel. So right then and there, the government of Iran does not get along with the government of Azerbaijan. That's number one. Number two, woven into the fabric of Azerbaijan is religious tolerance. That is anathema to the Iranian regime, to the extent that Jews, Christians, Baha'is in Azerbaijan can practice their faith, and hence the human right of practicing their faith is free and open in Azerbaijan. It's the exact opposite in Iran. In fact, while Baha'is are being persecuted in Iran on a daily basis, the Baha'i community in Azerbaijan can celebrate very important dates in the Philharmonic Orchestra, in the Philharmony of Azerbaijan, with beautiful music. That is a sharp contrast. So that's a second reason. And then, of course, the third reason why the Iranian regime not only does not like Azerbaijan, but also has tried throughout the years to undermine Azerbaijan, is because of Azerbaijan's strong ties to the US. There are deep, deep ties with the United States. I know for a fact that after September 11, the late President Haydar Aliyev invited the American ambassador to his office at that late hour and pledged his full support to the United States. And since then, relations have even grown stronger, especially on the intelligence military front. And so these three factors are why the Iranian regime does not get along with Azerbaijan, and in fact has tried to undermine the Azerbaijani government, the people of Azerbaijan, by trying to export its version of Islamic extremism into Azerbaijan. And on the flip side, it explains why the regime of Iran, a Shia country, has strong strategic ties to Armenia. That is an irony, if there were to ever be one, of international relations. Not necessarily because of the nature of what Armenia is, so much as what Azerbaijan presents to the government of Iran.
Thank you, Professor. You've also sort of hinted at a little bit of what I want to ask you about the U.S. relationship with Azerbaijan. Secretary of State Pompeo has recently invited the officials from Azerbaijan and Armenia to Washington, D.C. for Friday, I believe. And the question is, what part might the U.S. now play in maybe bringing these two governments together and possibly brokering some kind of either a ceasefire or something back to the frozen conflict or peace, all three being completely different. But what part might the U.S. play and why?
It's my personal feeling that the United States still plays the indispensable role on the global stage when it comes to conflict resolution. When you look back at some of the most difficult conflicts, such as the one in the Balkans, it was, after all, the late, ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, who brokered it with President Clinton's leadership, and we had the Dayton Accords, and that, years later we see the Abraham Accord. Signed in Washington. It wasn't signed in Moscow. It wasn't signed in London, nor was it signed in Paris. It was signed in Washington. So Washington still carries weight. And I feel that when it comes to the issue of Azerbaijan and Armenia, the United States can play a more robust, can play a more active role. And I'm hoping that Secretary Pompeo does step up to the plate, does offer both sides a reason to sign a peace agreement that preserves the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, but also acknowledges the historic grievances that Armenia has had, especially when we look back into history of what happened during the Ottoman Empire.
And the Ottoman Empire issue that you were talking to has more to do with Armenia and Turkey, their relationship, right? And I have a question about the Armenian diaspora in the US. It has been sort of hinted at, or at least from the 25,000 foot view, I'm getting the impression that the US is leaning a little bit toward Armenia in this conflict. And I'm wondering if it's because of the Armenian diaspora, which is very vocal in Washington, D.C. Is that part of the reason why I'm getting that feeling? Or is it true that the U.S. is sort of leaning toward Armenia, or which in fact is not paying attention to the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan? Do you have any comments on that?
There's certainly no doubt that members of Congress, such as Frank Pallone, Mr. Menendez of New Jersey, get a massive amount of funding from the Armenian diaspora, and so they have very strong ties to the Armenian community. But when it comes to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, I don't believe that there is a bias towards Armenia. In fact, I would suggest that maybe there is a stronger relationship with Azerbaijan, simply because Azerbaijan has proven itself a worthy ally. After all, Azerbaijani troops are fighting, or fought, I should say, alongside American special forces in Kosovo. They've fought in Afghanistan and they fought in Iraq. Armenia is a strong partner of Russia. Russia has military bases in Armenia. So as far as the U.S. Congress, you're absolutely right. I think there is definitely a bias, I would say, towards Armenia. But as far as the U.S. government is concerned, I think it's even-handed. But what is unfortunate, at least in my opinion, is that Armenia has enormous potential should there be peace with Azerbaijan. And it's unfortunate that the Armenian diaspora has espoused the narrative on Capitol Hill that doesn't talk about the day after peace. Instead, it's a narrative of victimization. And that narrative really, in my opinion, does not serve the interests of the Armenian people. It may serve the interests of a narrow group of Armenian lobbyists, but it doesn't serve the interests of the Armenian people who deserve a better future. I mean, you just have to look at the economic situation in Yerevan and compare it to Baku. Baku is a dynamic capital, a lot of activity, a lot of buzz. You know, you don't find that in Yerevan, and it's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate because I think the Armenian diaspora has espoused the narrative that is very narrow, as opposed to espousing the narrative that peace means economic development.
I thank you, Professor. I'm loath to be the skeptic, but I can't help but wonder if part of the reason why Secretary Pompeo has asked for this meeting in Washington, D.C. has a political agenda attached to it. Can you speak to that a little bit?
There's no doubt that every president tries to take advantage of situations, whether foreign policy or domestic, as we get closer and closer to an election. So you're right, there may be an element of grandstanding, there may be an element of electioneering, but I do know from my own personal conversations with friends in the State Department, American diplomats such as Ambassador Andrew Schofer and the French, that there is a genuine interest on the part of the United States to solve this conflict. There is a genuine interest on the part of the State Department to get in front of this issue and solve this conflict. And irrespective of what the White House motivation may or may not be, I can assure you that our professional diplomats at the State Department are working night and day to make sure that this conflict doesn't get out of hand, there are no more casualties, and that this peace agreement is arrived at.
Thank you. What about the Minsk Group? Do you have any faith? I mean, if in fact the U.S. is not successful in brokering some kind of a ceasefire or an end to the conflict, do you have any faith that the Minsk Group might be able to step in and renegotiate some kind of a reduction or mitigation of the conflict?
Well, I think the intentions of the US and France have always been to try to resolve this and resolve this quickly. But I've always been a strong skeptic of Russia. In my opinion, Russia has always wanted this conflict to stay frozen. Because frozen conflicts are the best gift for Moscow. And so I've always felt that Russia never wanted and never will want a final settlement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, because that means that they will be independent, meaning Azerbaijan and Armenia, and independent countries are not what Mr. Putin wants. He wants the periphery to be obedient to Moscow. Now, the one player that was not involved, but today is involved, is Turkey. Today, we see a very, very robust, strong, moral, diplomatic support from Turkey towards Azerbaijan. And that might be as a result of frustration that Mr. Erdogan and his predecessors, Mr. Demirel, Mr. Turgut Özal, felt towards the Minsk Group. In other words, there was this feeling that the Minsk Group, made up of Russia, US, and France, just simply could not get it done. And so I think Mr. Erdogan finally said to himself, you know what, this is not working. And I'm going to get involved on one side and let's get it taken care of, because it hasn't been taken care of. And from his perspective, taking care of essentially means Azerbaijan getting back the territories that have been occupied.
I have a little bit more interest in finding out what the motivation might have been behind Secretary of State Pompeo's quote that Turkey's role has increased the risk of further violence. Why would he say that? What was the motivation behind that kind of a statement?
I think the United States feels that maybe the involvement of Mr. Erdogan has a policy that goes beyond assistance to Azerbaijan. After all, Turkey is also involved in the Syria front. It's involved in the Libya front. It's now involved in a dispute with Greece. And so I think that Mr. Pompeo is just looking at the map and thinking, okay, maybe we don't want Turkey to play a vocal role here. And maybe that's Mr. Pompeo's motivation. He, better than anyone, knows and understands that it would not serve anyone's interests if this becomes a proxy where all of a sudden you have Russia facing Turkey. That's the last thing we need. And so I think that's why Mr. Pompeo is making this statement. I'm sure he'll probably make the same statements as it concerns Moscow if he feels that Moscow isn't stepping up to the plate.
So thank you, Professor. I just to take us off a little bit about the seriousness of everything, I see a painting behind you, and I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit. It reminds me of some things that I've seen in Baku before. So I'm wondering if you can tell me what the history is behind that painting.
Thank you very much for that question. And I'm grateful that you asked it, because I think one of the things that has bothered me over the years that I visited Azerbaijan is the beautiful fabric that makes Azerbaijan, the beautiful social, cultural fabric that makes Azerbaijan so unique. And this painting over my shoulder, I think, encapsulates that beautiful fabric of Azerbaijan. The gentleman behind me, his name is Zeynalabdin Taghiyev, and he was the first Baku oil millionaire. At the turn of the century, he used his money to build schools for girls. This is 1900, a Muslim country where someone steps up to the plate by the name of Zeynalabdin Taghiyev, gentleman over my shoulder, and built the first schools for girls. And then he went beyond that, Joanna, and built specifically schools for medical training, because he was adamant that there's no reason why girls and boys shouldn't be equal. And there's no reason why men and women should not be equal. And I think, again, this goes to the fabric and the DNA of Azerbaijan. You've visited, you've been there. It's an open society. Men and women are treated equally. And so this painting over my head, I think, captures the essence of what Azerbaijan's about.
Thank you, Professor. I now have a question about the internally displaced persons in Azerbaijan that, as a result of the war in the 90s, there's almost 1 million people displaced, and that's something that the West is not very fully aware of. This is a story, as you say, stories are really important in Azerbaijan, but this is a story that is not reaching the West. And I'm wondering if you can speak to why some particular stories don't resonate as well across the West. Armenia seems to be doing a pretty good job telling its story in Nagorno Karabakh, but the internally displaced persons in Azerbaijan, their story isn't being told as well. Why is Azerbaijan missing out on these opportunities to wage this war on words and images?
Thank you also for asking that question. On the first night that I arrived in Azerbaijan, there were gunfire, there were bodies being brought back from the front, and a lot of children and women that I saw the first time when I was there were displaced. They were displaced from the front, and so from Karabakh and from the 20% of those territories that the Armenians had occupied. And so in the early days, unfortunately, Azerbaijan did not have the financial resources to take care of these internally displaced people. Many of them lived in very difficult conditions. Thankfully, today, the Azerbaijan Sovereign Wealth Fund, which, by the way, is considered by Swiss authorities as one of the most transparent, has been able to accumulate approximately $42 billion, and some of that money has now been allocated to at least improve the condition of the internally displaced. But, in addition to the internally displaced, when one reads articles, even as recent as the recent fighting, one never sees a journalist talk about this issue, which is unfortunate. And we also don't see the fact that 20% of Azerbaijan's territory is occupied. And we don't even see that. It's simply referred to as a conflict. And that's the other sad irony. And so the internally displaced story doesn't get resonance simply because I think journalists have, for the lack of a better word, not been exposed maybe, but it's an unfortunate side of this conflict. And as I said, in the early days, a lot of these internally displaced were placed in old abandoned train cars. They had very difficult conditions, but thankfully the First Lady of Azerbaijan, Mehriban Aliyeva, she's taken on the cause of making sure that these internally displaced have the adequate housing and any other need or necessity that comes with being internally displaced. Most important, education. So the First Lady has actually stepped up to the plate and made sure that every single displaced Azerbaijani has access to education.
Thank you, Professor. I want to end with maybe getting your thoughts on what steps can be taken. These negotiations and talks and bilateral and trilateral discussions to try to find a ceasefire notwithstanding, what are some of the steps that we can find to win the peace in this area?
If I were Secretary Pompeo, the way that I would look at this is 3 steps. 3 steps that are encapsulated in an agreement. First step in the agreement, confidence building measures. Make sure that the people of Armenia, the people of Azerbaijan get to know each other, get to understand each other. I think that's extremely important. So a series of confidence building measures. Maybe it's an address by President Aliyev to the Armenian people. Maybe it's an address by the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, to the people of Azerbaijan. Then maybe it's an exchange of mothers, Armenian mothers visiting, mothers in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijani mothers visiting mothers in Armenia. So exchange of human to human. Music is in the DNA of Armenia. Music is in the DNA of Azerbaijan. Maybe a joint concert in Paris, a joint concert in Washington, a joint concert in Moscow. With the Philharmonic Orchestra of Azerbaijan and Armenia performing Bach, Beethoven, Mozart. So we start with the confidence building measures. But then beyond the confidence building measures, there has to be a concrete line item that once these confidence building measures are met and done, that Armenia relinquishes the occupied territories that it holds. That's number 2. And then number 3, it is a discussion of the status of Nagorno Karabakh. Now, step number 2 and 3 has to also acknowledge and take into account the very, very legitimate grievance that Armenians have had because of the history. And so I think it's important that every piece of territory that Armenia relinquishes and is given back to Azerbaijan, there are UN troops, UN peacekeepers in those territories, so as to assure the Armenian population that nothing bad is going to happen. And also the same thing, finally, I believe, with Nagorno Karabakh itself. I think if there were to be maybe French troops in Nagorno Karabakh, because of the long history of France and Armenia, that there may be an acceptance by the Armenians that, okay, if there are French troops, we can at least put our head to bed at night knowing nothing bad is going to happen. But I think that these three elements essentially revolve around the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, for which there are 4 UN resolutions, and addressing the security needs of the Armenians. I think this, in a nutshell, should and can be what I would at least recommend to Mr. Pompeo.
Thank you for your unique strategies, Professor. I'm so optimistic knowing that there are people like you maybe making these kinds of suggestions around the world. And thank you, Professor Rob Sobhani, Chairman and CEO of Caspian Group and expert on Russia and former professor. That's why I kept calling you Professor.
Well, thank you.
But thank you for your insights and for your unique strategies.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you for having me. And hopefully we will meet up again soon in Baku.
Yes, that would be great.
Absolutely.
And go to the ballet.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
I hope it worked out.